All right, we're live. Hello, my name is Jarrett. I'm an online store manager at Sweet Maria's, but I also have a background in specialty coffee.
I'm Julia. I'm an educator here at Sweet Maria's. I have some roasting experience and QC experience, which we're going to talk about here today.
And, kind of what we're going to be talking about is the relationship between cacao and coffee. And the reason we really started thinking about this is because Thompson would often bring back cacao that he would purchase from coffee producing countries. And the cacao he was bringing back was pretty interesting, but it was also pretty rustic. What he was bringing back was not super duper high grade. It had sticks and all sorts of interesting debris in it, but it was still really good and it was really interesting and it was fun to try in the context of, coffee, especially considering, what a significant section of the flavor wheel is just cacao.
Dedicated to chocolate nuts.
And so we started thinking about it more and we started experimenting with it. And what we're going to do today is just hopefully talk a little bit about the relationship between coffee and cacao, both from a flavor perspective as well as a roasting and production perspective. And just kind of explain why we're excited about it. I think we will, provide some context, which is we are not experts on cacao. We're kind of just going to be talking about our, personal experience with it in these last few weeks, and also, our experience with it as a business at Sweet Maria's. We're just going to, share our journey. But with that being said, we also want to shout out some really great resources if this seems interesting to you and you want to go further. One of them is a website called Chocolate Alchemy. You can just Google Chocolate Alchemy. They'll probably come out right on top. And they have a lot of great information. And they also sell some great cacao that you could roast at home. And the other is Uncommon Cacao, which is where we got the cacao that we're going to be talking about today.
If you're familiar with any of our info pages, the Uncommon Cacao has very similar info pages on their cacao, and it's a similar read, and it's very interesting if you have been absorbing that content before. It's just like an interesting way to see that a lot of the differences, but a lot of things that are similar in coffee and cacao.
And I'll also say that a lot of what we are talking about today is also going to be on our library. We have one library page up right now that talks a little bit more about how and why we started thinking about cacao at Sweet Maria's. And we'll have more going up soon, kind of explaining a lot about, what we're going to be talking about today.
Okay.
So the first thing we got to talk about is the relationship of cacao and coffee with regard to flavor.
Should we mention that cacao is the name for the unroasted product, where cocoa is after it has been roasted. So we will probably mention both things today. So first we'll be talking
and I'll also probably get it backwards a couple of times.
So cacao is the raw product that we're talking about now.
And cocoa is the roasted product. So I think something that Thompson really found interesting and wanted to emphasize is the idea of bitterness. Bitterness is often thought about for lots of products as a negative aspect, especially in coffee.
There aren't any positive descriptors for bitterness in coffee.
And like if you've been a barista, somebody will come and be like, which one of these is the least bitter, and also, I was referencing an old 90s commercial where a company was advertising like this beer doesn't give you bitter beer face. And in the modern context, a lot of beers on the can now will advertise the IBU, the bitterness units, as a positive aspect. And certainly bitterness is a positive aspect. And an interesting thing about coffee is that it's a very common product that we all consume, where bitterness is very forward.
Yeah.
And that's true for cocoa as well. Like cocoa fundamentally is somewhat bitter.
Things also like tea, they have bitter notes to them that we pursue.
So let's just think about like chocolate as a flavor descriptor. I mean, what does that mean really?
Oh, for our company and writing flavor descriptors, it's kind of a umbrella term that we use. So when writing product reviews, it's interesting to see how it is broken down as far as kind of the royal we are concerned. We have an article that was written by Tom in 2020 that is called Coffee, Chocolate, and Bitterness. And it kind of goes over that umbrella and breaks it down into sections of more common uses. Words like baking chocolate, bittersweet chocolate, milk chocolate, and cocoa powder, and how those are related to coffees, where like a baking chocolate will be more of a bitter and intense kind of flavor. It comes from low acid and has minimal sweetness, whereas something like bittersweet is kind of like a generic catch-all for like a bean to bar sort of Scharfenberger kind of bittersweet flavor and taste. And whereas milk chocolate is more of a softer experience, we were saying that comes from first comes to mind something like Brazil, something low grown with low acidity, but also has really nice balance. It's kind of really easy to understand. It's more of a relatable flavor, kind of like a C's candy as opposed to a Scharfenberger. And then cocoa powder is just like the clear, defined chocolate taste that's more on the dry side with some nut, but also, steering clear of any fruited notes. Then there were kind of like secondary modifiers that we use that are cocoa nibs, which would be kind of a more bold and bittering flavor. And then something like Mexican drinking chocolate that would blend sugar and spices into cocoa. So those are some kinds that we use frequently that we think that people can associate with. And on that, when we were talking about this, we were emphasizing that roast really matters when it comes to tasting coffee with chocolate notes in them, because chocolate flavors aren't intrinsically tied to the roast level, but roast can definitely highlight a varietal characteristic if it is there initially.
And I mean, I think the interesting thing for me, especially considering chocolate as an umbrella flavor, I mean, it's very common for people to say like, oh, this coffee is really chocolatey. Just considering the ones we've outlined so far, comparing even bittersweet chocolate to milk chocolate, those are totally different taste sensations that all fall under the umbrella of chocolate. And, right now we're talking about chocolate, but chocolate itself has separate characteristics from cocoa, because cocoa has much less processing than even a very, basic chocolate. And so that was like a really interesting, thing to sort of explore and learn about, because certainly I hadn't really given it any deep thought before we started actually roasting, some cocoa here, which we're going to talk about in just a minute. But as soon as we started doing that, I kind of realized that the perceptions that I had about what cocoa tastes like, or where, what components really contribute to that like taste sensation, I mean, we're just totally miscalibrated. And so it was really interesting to, go all the way back to the bean. I mean, we were eating even some unroasted, cacao, and start from there and work through, how does that taste? How does just freshly roasted cocoa taste? How does it taste after a few days? comparing that to, it was
Brewing
just
it.
Halloween. So
Yeah.
comparing that to like chocolate, and then brewing it, which we're going to talk more about, it was just really interesting. And it was a total recalibration, especially around this idea of bitterness and, what are the positive aspects of that?
We roasted cacao in our Be More roaster on many different profiles, and we ended up cupping them in a formal cupping setting, which we weren't sure if it was going to work. So we kind of rustically ground a bunch of different roasts and formatted them like a cupping. But it was interesting to see that that did actually work. We were able to pick out varietal characteristics and positive and negative attributes from each roast that kind of focused our learning and kind of took us down better routes for how to roast it better moving forward. So that was something that we hadn't read about before, and we just kind of did it on the fly, and it actually was very informative. So that was a super cool learning experience as far as this whole thing goes.
So do you want to talk a little bit more about like how cacao is similar or different from coffee, or do you want to talk a little bit about the experimentation we did?
Well, I think it would be good to touch on similarities and differences. The clear similarity being that a lot of cacao, there are varietals of trees that are grown in the same regions as coffee, which initially is why Tom was able to access it so frequently. So they're just kind of there side by side. And then the fermentation processes are very similar, which is interesting, although when you smell green coffee that's been processed, it smells much different than raw cacao because the fermentation process is so much stronger, and it's more of the flavor characteristics come from the fermentation process of cacao, whereas the roasting process actually just kind of gets rid of those volatile acetic acids and all of those kind of vinegary fermentation, all the byproducts of fermentation, whereas roasting coffee, you're just kind of bringing out the best characteristics of it throughout the drying phases. So that was shocking.
I mean, it was like, I'm sure all of you who are roasting green coffee know that often when you cut open a bag of, let's say, like a washed green coffee, it often has like a, grassy or hay-like smell. It doesn't smell anything like what the finished roasted product will, but it also doesn't smell bad. It doesn't have a strong smell, I would say. But this cacao has a very strong smell.
Yes.
And it's very vinegary, and I would not, for me at least, not entirely pleasant.
Yes. Roasting will take care of that. Once you roast cacao, it has a much more classic roasted cocoa smell.
Right. I mean, right now we have some things we're going to show you behind us that smell like chocolate. And in front of me, I have the cacao. So I'm kind of caught in between the two worlds right now. Whereas if I turn my head this way, I get the vinegar smell. And if I turn my head this way, I get the delicious chocolate smell that's just like permeating this room.
While roasting cacao, the differences there were that cacao prefers a more low and slow approach to roasting, much longer roast durations, up to half an hour, which much lower temperatures like 250 to 350. So that's where the Be More kind of comes into play as a great roaster for cacao. And also, as you mentioned, that there were sticks in the raw product, which is pretty standard.
Even for
higher grade.
Higher grade.
So
very different from coffee in that way.
The sorting practices are a little bit different, and then also in roasting cacao, it's not like the cracks are what help separate the husk from the actual bean, but it doesn't dictate doneness of roast, which is something that's true to roasting coffee. Usually it gets cracking, and then you can tell by your sense of hearing when you've finished first crack or when you're headed into second crack. But within roasting cacao, it's just a intermittent popping. So you have to rely much more on your sense of smell. And I didn't realize that until I had done a few roasts. But there are these kind of benchmarks. Like there are some aromas like the classic smell of like brownie edges caramelizing, which is something that is near and dear to my heart from being a child and waiting for brownies to bake. So that was kind of a benchmark that I used, was that of knowing that they were starting to get more roasted, and using that as a way to tell the doneness of the roast, since my sense of sound didn't really help.
Yeah, and I mean, I was less involved in the roasting. I kind of came in after the roasting was done just to check out what had happened.
Well, it permeates the whole building.
Yeah,
too.
I mean, you know when it's done. And so that was like really interesting to me, because so much of the discussion around roasting green coffee is around, especially in, air roasters, where you can see through the glass, like a fresh roast. It's all about just visually identifying, like it's visually at the darkness that I want. Yeah. And in fact, we sell a roasted coffee color card where you can use the card to, kind of figure out where you are. But that doesn't work with
right. And the fermentation of cacao also darkens the beans quite substantially. So the raw and the roasted don't look that much different from each other. So you can't really use your sense of sight in that regard either. You just really have to use your sense of smell, which is very different from roasting, where it goes from green to yellow to brown, and you can tell. This is just more, just got to feel it out.
Right. So we had some cacao in house. You kind of experimented with roasting it primarily in the Bmore, and Thompson, he started out roasting it in, a toaster oven. And so you can do that as well. You can do it in really anything with kind of any sort of regular oven with a convection setting. The airflow really, helps. And really what you're looking for is it to have that pleasant smell that you start to associate with chocolate.
Yeah, air type, something like the popper would not be good for this, because the mass of a cacao bean is something around 10 times what a coffee bean is. So you can't get enough movement in the chamber. So in something like a popper, the cacao would just sit there and burn and then ignite. So it's very dangerous in any other home roasting.
Yeah, and somebody asks, how long is the roast? And this is another point about why the air roasters don't work. Air roasters, if you have had the opportunity to experiment with different home coffee roasters, air roasters are fast.
Too fast, too hot.
They're high heat and, really smaller volumes, but they're really high heat and they roast the coffee quickly. And that's kind of why they're cool compared to some of the drum roasters, which have, in particular, like the Bmore, which have much longer roast times. And cacao really benefits from a low and slow approach. So on top of all the other physical reasons why air roasters don't work, one of them is that the roast time for cacao is like 18 to 20 plus minutes.
I experimented with setting with 15 minutes to as long as 23 minutes on the Bmore here. So, and then in the oven, I think Thompson experimented with, he went up to 30 or 40 minutes in a conventional oven. So much longer and lower temperatures to roast cacao. Yeah.
So the roast times in a Bmore are anywhere from, 18 to 23 minutes in our experience. And that's what I think some of the, things we'll be tasting in a second were around an 18-minute.
Yeah. Yes.
And
these are the 23 minutes.
Oh, these are the 23 minutes. But, you get the idea. Much longer than, for instance, an air roaster, which is just another reason the air roasters don't work. So should we talk a little bit about, what we did to taste these?
Sure. Or
or,
methods with which
yeah,
to.
you have, at this point in our journey, we have roasted cacao.
Here we are.
We have cocoa.
Yes.
Now, what
do we do with it? Yes, with coffee, when you're roasting coffee at home, you know what you're going to do with it. You're going to grind it and you're going to brew it in your preferred method. But with cocoa, it's not as easy to define what you're going to do with it. So we experimented with a few things, and first of all, we just like to eat the raw bean.
Yeah, I mean, they're pretty enjoyable to eat. You can kind of just, if we have some roasted right here, you can kind of just grab it and just peel it. Mm-hmm. And you end up, the husk comes off and you end up with the cocoa bean.
The cocoa nib. This is the process of winnowing, is taking the outer shell off of the actual cocoa nib. And once you've roasted it, it usually comes apart in just like one little guy here.
And, eating this, you can already start to make an association with the flavors we experience in coffee and try to figure out where those overlaps are. Because, of course, chocolate doesn't taste like coffee and coffee doesn't taste like chocolate, but there are characteristics, for instance, like the bitterness that we experience in both that cause us to make that association. And I think, that's really what was interesting about comparing these together.
I also did pretty extensive experimentation on brewing a cocoa tea. A cocoa tea, it's a pretty, it's a far departure from classic hot chocolate, but you can see the similarities in it. It actually, we kind of crudely ground the bean and the husk, the whole product, the whole bean. We tried making some with just the nib or with just the husk, but the two together is what makes it a whole product. And
and you can kind of see this is just the brewed, cocoa tea, so to speak, and this is just water and ground cocoa, and it was simmered in a pot together for
5 minutes.
5 minutes or so, and then strained, and it kind of looks like watery chocolate milk is how I would describe it. But it's already kind of starting to take on some of.
It's kind of has like the nose of it. It smells like a Swiss Miss, like a packet of chocolate that you made with water that doesn't have super rich, milky characteristics. Like the aroma to me is something like very emotionally, again, going to the ice skating rink and getting like hot chocolate out of a machine. So very commercialized.
Yeah. And there's still, there is a tartness to the smell, which is pretty interesting. And that's kind of some of the origin characteristic coming through. Because I think this is the Uganda, which had like a little bit more of the tart characteristic.
This is the Ecuador.
Oh, well, it's the Ecuador.
Yeah, there aren't as many extractables in the cocoa nibs as there are in coffee. So using the entire bean helps get a little more substance in the cup. But also we recommend getting it off the grounds right away because it gets kind of acrid. It gets a little, when you continue to brew it, a little more souring notes come through. So.
And then from here, the next step in the process was we started trying to think of a way like, okay, we have this brewed cocoa. Can we get a product that is more like hot chocolate? Yeah. Because hot chocolate commercial hot chocolate requires processing grinding the cocoa and then processing it into cocoa powder. And, to create cocoa powder, it's a whole process. It's not just like pulverizing the cocoa. you're separating out the fats. It's kind of interesting. And, some of those websites that we plugged earlier, like Chocolate Alchemy, go really deep into the process of how to do it. But
I do see a question here about resting times of coffee versus cacao, which I was looking into, where I have heard that actually resting it ground is the preference for cacao. I didn't look into it. I don't know exactly why, but I think part of the fermentation process helps. I don't know. It just gets better with age, which is counterintuitive.
It's very opposite of
the antithesis of what we know.
of coffee. And again, this is an interesting way in which they differ, because coffee, especially at Sweet Maria's, why do we home roast? We home roast so that we have access to really fresh coffee. We can experience that intensity that is sometimes lost when coffee ages out. Whereas for cocoa, aging seems to be like really the way to go.
Right. And also something we learned was that roasting longer and darker won't make a darker cocoa flavor. That'll just kind of make it more acrid. What most people do is find particular roasts that bring out a dark characteristic from each origin and blend them together to make a dark flavor. So roasting longer and roasting darker won't make like a higher grade cacao.
So, we were taking this brewed cocoa and kind of seeing how close we could get to a commercial product, which was kind of interesting. And then the last sort of step in our process, one that we, just really brought to the fore yesterday, was we started, Dan, who's in the chat, started designating some coffees that in his and Thompson's scored very high in terms of cocoa flavor. And we started tasting these. And of course, normally you don't want to get primed with what a coffee is supposed to taste like before you taste it, so you can make your own judgments. So we knew we were kind of looking for cocoa flavor. But we cupped these coffees yesterday, and it was really interesting. The first one that we cupped was the Brazil, which I have floating around here somewhere. There it is.
The Brazil Canastra Luis Otavio. Yes. We tried this coffee and we thought it had it was kind of the easiest one to understand as far as chocolate went. It was kind of knocked it right out of the park. It was not quite a bean to bar, but it was more that milk chocolate kind of relatable C's chocolate kind of chocolate on that coffee.
Yeah, really interesting. And I think you'll understand why this exercise was interesting, especially starting with this coffee, because this coffee drew out in me an obvious association with chocolate. You didn't have to stretch the imagination. Yes. It was just like, this coffee evokes chocolate in my mind. Yeah. And really those bittersweet characteristics are really kind of what drove that association, I think. Mm-hmm. And then the next one we tried was this Nicaragua. Uh-huh. And that one was a little different. Yeah. The Nicaragua Suyatao. Really great coffee. This one, the aroma of it was really roasty, but when we started tasting it, it didn't really present that.
Right. It was more balanced. I think the acidity of the coffee helped with the balance and gave it more of a bittersweet kind of drying aspect to it. Definitely evocative of chocolate. We had some interesting, we thought that it was more of a confectionery kind of sugar, like something that had been created from sugar, like a caramelized sugar. We had a note that we were kind of talking about like a chocolate croissant almost. So like a confectionery sweet kind of sugar.
And compared to the Brazil, which was obviously chocolatey, this one, it was really that confectionery component that kind of drove that association. So it wasn't like totally obvious, but you could still see, where that through line was, which was pretty interesting.
Yeah.
And then the next was the Guatemala.
Yes. San Martin. Piloto Pique. Yes. This is a coffee I know and love. Super balanced, really good acidity on this one. Very focused. I really like this. We had some interesting outliers of the banana taffy, which I didn't find from it, but
I got green apple, so
Yeah.
I was really out there.
Yeah.
And a thing about when we were tasting these coffees is that they were at a pretty light roast level when we were tasting them. I think that you noted most of them were around like 13% moisture loss.
Yeah.
And if you go on Sweet Maria's and look these coffees up, you can see in Dan's notes that really when you take these coffees to a darker roast level, that's when a lot of the richer chocolate associations come out.
Yes, very true.
And then the last was the Rwanda.
Yeah. Nyamasheke, Nayaka Bingo.
We have a lot of Rwandas right now. It's one of my favorite origins personally. For me, this one was the most chocolatey, at least in terms of what I associate with, milk chocolate.
Yeah. It was very aromatic chocolate to me, classic chocolate to me, but it was more intensely bittering.
Yeah, and I think what was really interesting about tasting, cupping these coffees in the context of this cacao that we've been roasting is that if I had been eating, a Hershey's bar or Halloween candy, because I think we did this on Halloween, I wouldn't have necessarily made these cocoa or chocolate associations, but after tasting them sort of like back to back and side to side, it really recontextualized that tasting note and recalibrated that in my mind.
Having them on the table, we were saying it was very evocative of chocolate was the term we kept throwing around. Yeah.
So I think the main thing we wanted to emphasize was just that the association between cacao and chocolate is multifaceted, both in terms of where it's produced, where it's grown, and how it's processed from a raw, product to a consumable product. There's a lot of overlap, and that's true in the flavor profile as well. And it was really interesting to try to understand what it is about them that tastes similar, since obviously they taste different. And do you have anything you want to add to that?
Just that I'm excited about that.
So we want to emphasize that we are not getting into cocoa. I think this was a really neat exercise, and we learned a lot, but also we learned that our wheelhouse is coffee. But at the same time, this was a lot of fun for us. I wasn't so involved in the roasting, but it seemed like an interesting challenge, and it smelled amazing.
If nothing else.
If nothing else, it smelled amazing. And especially the cupping was really interesting. And so we wanted to think of a way to offer that to Sweet Maria's customers. So we're going to be offering a really limited edition set that includes 2 pounds of raw cacao and also the 4 coffees that we cupped, so that if this seemed really interesting to people, they could try it out as well. And we have 2 different origins for the cacao. We have the Uganda Semiliki forest, and we also have the Ecuador organic CECAO. And we're going to have some library articles about these that are, one of them is up right now, and I'm sure there'll be more up this afternoon. And if this seems interesting to you, we'll have a bundle coming out soon as of the publishing of this live stream. It's really limited, and once we're out of it, I think our, at least raw cacao journey will be over. So, do you have anything else you want to add? Are there any like super
I don't know that there are any specific questions.
It seems like Dan and Thompson have been totally on top of it. So I hope this was informative. If this seems like something you're interested, definitely check out the library.sweetmarias.com. And you can also check out the web store, sweetmarias.com, right around the beginning of November 2023 to check out this cacao bundle we're offering.
Yeah.
All right. Thanks for tuning in. Hope you all have a great weekend.
Thank you. I didn't have